Hello film fans and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now, of all the villains Sherlock Holmes has ever fought, the most famous has got to be Professor James Moriarty. Originally created as a plot device in order for Holmes to die in the story The Final Problem, Moriarty has since taken on a life of his own as Sherlock Holmes' arch nemesis. There have been many different portrayals of him in different films and television shows. We've had Moriarty the refined gentleman, Moriarty the psychopath, even a female Moriarty in Elementary. But was there a real person behind Conan-Doyle's literary creation? In this episode, I aim to delve into the history of the literary Moriarty to discover the influences that enabled the creation of this literary masterpiece. Now for me, one of the things that really defines Professor Moriarty, and one of the things that many adaptations of him fail to take into account, is his ability to live a double life. This is something that's particularly explored in Sherlock Holmes' novel The Valley of Fear, where Holmes, Watson and Inspector MacDonald of Scotland Yard discuss Moriarty. Now, in this scene, MacDonald seems confused by Holmes' insistence that Moriarty is a villain. He points out that he himself has had talks with the good professor, and he sees him as a genuinely kindly old man who is interested only in advanced mathematics and tutoring young boys to send them into the army. Holmes points out during this conversation that Moriarty's ability to live a double life, essentially, is nothing new, and in fact compares him to a criminal from the previous century, one Jonathan Wild. Now, today, Wilde is a pretty much forgotten figure, but in his time he was incredibly famous, especially in London, where he plied his trade. Wilde characterised himself as the Thief-Taker General. Now, despite its official-sounding title, this was a post he completely made up himself. But that didn't stop him wearing a sword in public and acting as a gentleman in refined society. This is despite the fact that he'd arrived in London several years previously as simply a servant and had ended up in prison for debt. Now, what allowed Wilde to rise to the top of London's underworld was the notoriously harsh punishments that criminals were given at the time. It might sound strange to us now, but of course with no police force in the country, the only way the authorities thought that they could deter criminals from committing criminal acts was by incredibly harsh punishments. That meant that a theft of something as small as 5 shillings could lead to you becoming hung, and often did. Of course, this didn't deter criminals, it simply meant that criminals were more likely to be violent and steal more, because of course, if you're going to be hung for stealing 5 shillings, you might as well steal £20. Into this stepped Jonathan Wild. Wild realised that he could make a living for himself, living on both sides of the law. Apparently, Wild was a philanthropic citizen, going out of his way to find stolen property for anxious owners and hunting down thieves with his own army of thief-takers. In private, however, Wild was really the most powerful boss of London's underworld. This meant that not only did he know the right places to look for thieves, but it also meant that he could imprison thieves from rival gangs and exert his force on the London underworld at the time. This, I think, is where Conan-Doyle got the idea of Moriarty as the centre of a giant web of crime and a kingpin, if you like, of London's underworld. In the books, Moriarty is typified by the fact that he's rarely seen and appears outwardly respectable, but in fact he has a lot of criminals under his command, most famously, of course, Colonel Sebastian Moran, his lieutenant, and it's through these people that he controls everybody else. Eventually, Wilde's activities would get him into trouble when he decided to pick on a housebreaker called Jack Sheppard. Sheppard was a kind of rock star criminal of the age and famous for his many and varied escapes. Essentially, Sheppard could rival Harry Houdini in his ability to escape from cells. He once escaped from the condemned cell at Newgate by slipping his hands out of his handcuffs, picking the lock of the leg irons that bound him to the floor. Then, with his legs still in chains, he managed to climb up the fireplace, up the chimney, through 5 locked doors, then escaped out onto the roof, realised he needed a rope, so he traced his steps back, through the 5 locked doors again, down the chimney, grabbed his bed sheets, tied them together to make a rope, then retraced his steps yet again, and escaped down the roof. By this time, a crowd had gathered at the bottom, so he slipped away, joined the crowd, then created a distraction by saying he could see the criminal escaping across the roofs, and then when pandemonium ensued, he then slipped away quietly and escaped. Thankfully for Wilde, the only thing that Jack Sheppard was better at than escaping was getting caught again. He was really quite useless. At one point, Wilde's companions found Jack Sheppard completely drunk out on the floor of a gin shop, which meant that arresting him was really no problem at all. However, Sheppard's status as this kind of cult criminal, if you like, and the fact that he didn't rob with violence, and indeed most of his thefts were quite small amounts, meant that public opinion turned against Wilde. When Sheppard was finally hanged, he took a very long time to die. He didn't weigh very much at all, which of course was an advantage when it came to breaking into houses and slipping up chimneys, but it was a real problem when you were hanging someone, because in those days that was before the trap door was listed on gallows, and that meant you were simply hung by your own weight via gravity without the drop that in later years would break your neck. This meant that Sheppard essentially suffocated to death, and it took him several minutes before his body stopped twitching. This horrific death, coupled with the fact that a former accomplice of Wilde's attacked him in the courtroom during a trial and managed to cut his throat, meant that Wilde was put out of service for a while, and his weakened health, through the loss of blood he sustained during the attack, meant that he was simply unable to enforce his control on the underworld like he had been before. Eventually, the authorities, who also turned against him after his political use failed due to the public opinion turning against him, and they managed to finally pin the theft of a piece of lace on him, which was enough, in those days of course, to be hung. Wilde was dragged through the streets on a cart, together with two of his accomplices. He was pelted with rotten food by passers-by who hated him, and then the crowning insult was that the man who hung him, the executioner, had actually been a guest at Wilde's wedding. The crowning humiliation was that in the 19th century, Wilde's remains were dug up by the Royal College of Surgeons because they were interested in discovering sort of roots of criminality in criminals. And his skeleton can actually be seen today in the Hunterian Museum at Lincoln Inn's Fields. It's a particularly gory end, but one very befitting of such a ruthless and cruel-minded criminal. He once cut the ears off an ex-girlfriend of his to show that she'd been a prostitute. However, I think that Wilde definitely gave Conan-Doyle the idea behind Moriarty, the idea of this criminal boss who is outwardly respectable, but inwardly is a sadistic and clever criminal mastermind. Now, one of the other things that sets Moriarty apart in the Sherlockian universe is his status, not only as a gentleman, but also as a direct counterpart to Holmes. Well, Holmes is an amateur detective, a consulting detective for Scotland Yard who also deals privately. Moriarty is essentially a consulting criminal, if you like. He basically creates schemes for other criminals and then takes a percentage cut of the profits. Now, I think the idea behind this aspect of the Moriarty character came from another famous criminal who was operating about the same time as Conan-Doyle was writing, Adam Worth. Now, Worth was an American originally who made his living during the American Civil War by joining regiments, collecting the money that ensued. You were given a bounty when you joined a regiment as some incentive to try and join up. Then, once he collected the money, Worth would then desert, join another regiment, and repeat the process all over again. He eventually came to France during the end of the Franco-Prussian War, partly because he was being pursued throughout America by the Pinkerton Detective Agency, but also because in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, Paris, the French capital, was absolutely in chaos. There was no fixed government, and as a result, crime flourished. Worth and his associates created a secret gambling den with someone upstairs with a buzzer, so when the police arrived, they had time to conceal all the evidence by the time the police got downstairs. This made Worth quite a lot of money, but when the Pinkertons turned up again in France to try and catch him, he escaped again and went to London. Using the money he'd got from his illicit exploits in both America and in France, Worth was then able to set himself up as a gentleman, and essentially had the same role as Moriarty does in the books as a consulting criminal. Essentially, Worth would create schemes and then use his lieutenants to disseminate these through the criminal world. Most of his clients never knew who he was, and he always made sure that the schemes didn't include violence to try and make sure that Scotland Yard wouldn't be in too much of a hurry to try and find him. Despite this, Scotland Yard were desperate to catch this shadowy figure in the underworld, but because of Worth's caution, there was never really any evidence to link his criminal activities to himself. Now, probably Worth's most famous exploit was his theft of a recently discovered Gainsborough picture during the late 19th century. This picture was of Georgina, Countess of Devonshire, who was herself quite a notorious figure. She, during political campaigns, would grant kisses to voters if they chose to vote for the candidate she was supporting. Worth and his associates slipped into the gallery one night, cut the portrait out of its stretcher where it was being held, and then slipped away into the darkness. The theft was a national sensation, but no one had any idea who had taken it, nor where it had gone. There were actually several hoaxes where people claimed to have discovered the portrait, but nothing was ever heard of it for a quarter of a century. Now, Worth had actually stolen the picture because his brother had got stuck in prison and Worth needed money to bail him out. However, just after he stole the portrait, his brother was then released without bail. So Worth now had the picture, there was a national sensation going on, but instead of selling it, Worth decided to hold on to it. I think he'd taken rather a fancy to it, and it is indeed quite a pretty picture. But that meant that Worth's two associates who'd got involved were rather cross, because of course Worth didn't sell it. That meant there were no proceeds in which to enrich them. Eventually, Worth was forced to break with both of them after one of them tried to get him to admit in front of a police informant that he'd actually been involved in the robbery. Soon afterwards, Worth took a trip to Belgium, to Liège. During the trip, in short of money, he decided, with two untried associates, rather untypically, to commit a robbery himself on a money cart that was being delivered to a local bank. This went spectacularly wrong, and he alone, out of the three men involved, was captured. Now, despite the fact that the Pinkertons suspected that he was actually involved in far more criminal activities than simply stealing money off carts, nothing could be linked to him from his previous criminal activities. Such was his success. However, that didn't really matter because he was still given 7 years for theft and stuck in a Belgian prison. While he was in prison, Worth's criminal associates took the opportunity to get other inmates to beat him up. Such was their contempt for him. And indeed, he suffered personal tragedy when his wife, who was supposed to be being looked after by one of his criminal associates, was seduced and then left, and she went virtually insane and was stuck in a lunatic asylum. Worth eventually was released from prison and was supposed to have spent all the money which he'd got from his previous criminal exploits, and finally died in poverty. You can actually see his grave today in London, and it actually says on his gravestone that he was a Napoleon of crime, which I think is quite cool. Now, according to Conan Doyle's friend Vincent Starrett, Conan Doyle actually said to him that one of the influences for Professor Moriarty was Adam Worth, and certainly there is a very strong resemblance in Moriarty's cleverness and his position at the centre of a grand web of intrigue and crime, together with the fact that he doesn't really reveal his appearance very often and that no one is entirely sure who he is, which was Adam Worth's trademark in real life. Now, the final influence on the Moriarty character is possibly the most interesting, that of his academic pretensions. Now, in the Conan Doyle stories, we are specifically told by the author that Moriarty was a professor at a small English university, but he was later forced to leave due to the fact that there were some shady dealings surrounding his activities there. However, Moriarty's skills as a brilliant mathematician later lead to his excellence in the field of crime when it comes to creating criminal strategies. Now, it has been suggested that there was actually some real academics that inspired Conan Doyle with the idea of this creation of an academic criminal, if you like. Possibly the most interesting was a man named Simon Newcomb. Now, Newcomb was an Canadian-American who spent quite a bit of time at Harvard, while also spending some time at Cambridge University in England as well. Newcomb was an astrophysicist, and his main interests were astronomy, particularly the orbits of planets. Newcomb was very highly regarded in the academic community at the time, despite the fact that he famously said that it would be almost impossible for flying machines to be created. he clearly didn't quite understand the ideas of lift. And this was especially embarrassing for him because he said it right about the same time as the Wright brothers were inventing their flying machine at Kitty Hawk. Nevertheless, Newcomb was an excellent academic, but his one flaw was that he had an incredibly aggressive attitude towards anyone whom he considered to be his rival. This included virulent attacks in academic journals and also behind-the-scenes subterfuge to ensure that his rivals didn't get high university offices like fellowships or professorships. Now, I personally think that Newcomb was probably more of a basis for Conan-Doyle's other great literary creation, Professor Challenger, who appears most famously in Conan-Doyle's brilliant novel The Lost World. This is because not only is Challenger also famous in the stories for his virulent attacks upon anyone who happens to disagree with him, but also because of the way he looked. Newcomb was very tall, with dark hair and a long black beard, and this is how Challenger is described. He also had an incredibly piercing gaze, judging from pictures of him from the time, and this is also something that is very much impressed upon the reader by the descriptions of Challenger in the books. However, possibly an even more interesting influence upon the character of Moriarty is where Conan Doyle got the name Moriarty in the first place. Now, I think you'll agree, it's a brilliant name. It sounds both aristocratic but also faintly sleazy and sly. It's absolutely brilliant. But apparently, according to people from Conan Doyle's old school, there were actually two brothers, both surnamed Moriarty, who went to school at the same time as Conan Doyle. Not only that, one of them, the younger, called Michael, was a brilliant mathematician. He was virtually a mathematical prodigy and actually won awards for it at school. Hence, possibly, the basis for Conan Doyle's Moriarty being an excellent mathematician. However, even more interesting is his older brother, John, who later became an extremely senior barrister and judge in Ireland. John Moriarty was famous for being quite sly, almost cunning in his legal dealings. People often describe him rather unfavourably as that he'd rather lose a case by trying a trick than to win one fairly by honest means. Whether that was simply slander, I don't know, but it is certainly true that people described when John Moriarty got up in court to speak, how he uncoiled himself. And in both the pictures and the descriptions of the Professor Moriarty of the Sherlock Holmes stories, he's always leaning forward slightly in a slightly reptilian manner, as if he has just uncoiled himself. So possibly this may be something that Conan Doyle either noticed from his old schoolfellow while they were at school, or something he later read about and simply incorporated it into the character of Moriarty in his books. Either way, it's absolutely fascinating and something I must confess I didn't know about until I started researching for this video. It's absolutely amazing that Conan Doyle was actually basing, in part at least, the character of Moriarty on people he actually knew at school. It's almost as brilliant as Ian Fleming basing Goldfinger upon an architect whose architecture he didn't like. It's absolutely brilliant. So, in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that the character of Professor Moriarty was not simply one man, but rather an amalgamation of many different influences. Conan Doyle almost certainly gathered the name Moriarty from his school days, and may possibly have based the appearance of Moriarty, or at least the way he acted, upon certain characteristics which the brothers Moriarty, whom he met as a child, also may have had. However, the idea of a criminal genius, a master of the underworld with a foot in both the genteel social life of London, but also the criminal underworld, was almost certainly based upon people like Jonathan Wild and Adam Worth, who occupied similar positions, albeit at very different time periods. So yes, it's absolutely fascinating when you delve into it more. I must confess that I had no idea when I started out on this video that I'd uncover the fact that Moriarty, the name, actually came from a real person. I've never met anybody with the name Moriarty, and I'd always assumed it was a made-up name before making this video. So yes, this has been absolutely fascinating for me, and I hope it was interesting for you to watch as well. That being said, that was the Sherlockian. Thank you very much for watching, film fans, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.